Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is the fourth module of continuing education related to school HACCP and school food safety. In this module, we will tackle the topic of food allergens and controlling allergens in school kitchens. Hopefully, you are somewhat aware of food allergens. Handling food allergens is important in food service of any kind, but especially in school food service. There has been an increase in attention related to this area over the last 5 or 6 years. Conversations with cafeteria managers and cafeteria staff about this increase in allergens have highlighted some major questions and concerns. We never really worried about this a while ago, so why is it happening now? What are the differences in our food system that might be contributing to it? What are some of the issues we should be concerned about? This module will try to address these questions. It will focus on explaining food allergies, why they are important, what causes them, and how to manage them within a school setting. This module will provide 1 hour of continuing education for the NC Department of Public Instruction in the School Nutrition Key Area of Operations, Area of General Food Safety. Let's start with the science. What is a food allergy? A food allergy is a body's reaction to something that is ingested in a food or from the environment. Something within that food causes the immune system to attack it. Many doctors have highlighted that it's not a function of someone's immune system or body not being prepared for a contaminant, but it's the fact that our bodies or immune systems are actually looking for contaminants all the time. There are certain things that we eat, specifically proteins in a food, that trick the body into thinking that the protein is something very, very bad. The body's reaction to this is to try to flush that protein out as quickly as possible. We will discuss the symptoms of a food allergy later in this module, but the body mainly reacts by producing antibodies, which then leads to the symptoms. When someone with a food allergy encounters the specific protein they are allergic to, it creates an immune response where antibodies are created and they experience the symptoms of an allergic reaction. There is a big difference, technically and scientifically, between a food sensitivity or intolerance and a food allergy. We will give some information about food sensitivities throughout this module, but the focus will be on food allergies, allergens, and allergic reactions. You may know someone who has a food allergy, for example, a child with a peanut allergy. For many who have a peanut allergy, consuming a food that has even the smallest amount of peanuts will cause that person to have an anaphylactic reaction. We will discuss the difference between anaphylactic shock and other symptoms later in this module, but an anaphylactic reaction is one where the body's initial reaction is to swell up, constricting the person's airways and causing breathing problems. Consider someone who has a food intolerance. Here, the situation is very different. In someone with a food intolerance, consuming a certain food or ingredient can heighten the immune response. If such a person then came in contact with another environmental allergen that they were also allergic to, like dust or grass, it would make their reaction even more severe. This is important for us as we look at food allergens, especially in kitchens. There are only a handful of foods that make up the majority of food allergies. 8 different foods, each containing a specific protein, cause over 90% of the food allergies in the U.S. Because these top 8 cause most food allergies, they are the ones we focus on in the U.S. Why are allergens important? There is no data on exactly how many people are allergic to certain food allergens, but scientists estimate that between 4 and 8% of children and around 2% of adults in the U.S. suffer from a food allergy. Food allergen responses vary. Some responses can be very serious, such as anaphylaxis, but others are less serious, with people experiencing symptoms like rashes, hives, or burning or tingling sensations. These children are having reactions that fall somewhere between life-threatening and minor discomfort. Let's consider some numbers. Using 4 to 8%, we can conservatively estimate that about 1 in 10 students, at most, that are coming through our cafeterias will have some likelihood, on average, of having a food allergy. Food allergies are the leading cause of anaphylaxis in the U.S., and there are around 30,000 emergency room visits, 2,000 hospitalizations, and 150 deaths per year from food allergies and from reactions to those allergies. Are food allergies on the rise from 4 to 8%? It's hard to say because the literature is not very clear. We understand and talk more about food allergies than we did 20 or even 10 years ago, but if the frequency is increasing, it has not likely increased very much. Greater awareness of the issue with food allergens makes it seem like food allergies have increased. Those who are passionate about this issue, especially for children and food allergens, are driving that increase in awareness. Some very passionate and successful parent groups have really tried to raise awareness of allergens. Their efforts, along with influence from past issues, have elevated the handling of food allergens in food service from something that was loosely regulated to a food safety concern. Labeling is now mandatory on food items, and food service staff have to follow strict handling practices to reduce the likelihood that someone is going to get sick. How do allergens occur? Let's take a look under the microscope at what we see in food. All foods are composed of macro and micromolecules. Macromolecules include proteins, nucleic acids, or the DNA that's in every food cell, carbohydrates, and lipids, or fats. Macromolecules are very large particles that our food is broken down into as we eat. Micromolecules, on the other hand, are things like vitamins and minerals. These types of macro and micromolecules, called nutrients, are essential for life. To get a better sense of the relative size of macro and micromolecules, a large protein would be the size of a minivan, and a vitamin would be the size of a tennis ball. The size and scale of these molecules is part of the reason why our immune systems have a reaction to proteins and not other smaller molecules. When proteins are digested and get into our cell structure, they are much, much larger and are somehow able to trick our immune system. Although digestion also creates some other large food components, proteins have a way of causing the body to mistake them for allergens. Scientists have been studying food allergies over the past 40 or 50 years to better understand the specific mechanisms proteins use. And though they have developed some theories, the research is still not clear on why this happens. They just know that proteins are the cause. Now we can think about allergens in the context of those macromolecules. Allergens, as we have mentioned already, are always proteins. Proteins are a chain of one or more amino acids that are found in all living organisms. Most people don't usually think of fresh fruits and vegetables as sources of proteins, but they actually do contain proteins. Typically, people associate proteins with meats, dairy, and eggs. Nearly every food product has at least a small amount of a protein. Proteins should not be confused with oils, which are lipids, and sugars, which are carbohydrates. A highly refined and filtered, or highly processed, oil will only contain lipids or fats and will not cause an allergic reaction. The refining and filtering process removes any proteins, which we know are necessary for allergic reactions. Pure sugars cannot cause food allergies either. Lactose is a sugar, not a protein, found in dairy products, so it cannot cause an allergic reaction. This means that lactose intolerance is not a food allergy. There is quite a bit of confusion, both at the parent, consumer, and societal levels about the differences between these issues of intolerances versus allergies. Intolerances may cause some discomfort, an upset stomach, or diarrhea, while an allergen can cause symptoms such as anaphylaxis. There is a myth that if someone is allergic to peanuts, for instance, they need to always avoid peanut oil. The science says that this is not entirely true. If the oil is highly refined, in theory, there would not be any peanut allergens in there. However, there is an extremely small chance that a small protein could have made it through that refining process and is present in the oil. People who are allergic to peanuts may make a personal choice to avoid peanut oil entirely. Part of this decision depends on whether they want to avoid or further reduce the risk even more, just in case something went wrong. For example, someone in your school may inquire about peanut oil for certain foods used in deep fat frying. This person may choose to avoid that peanut oil because they have a peanut allergy, although it should be a very low-risk food if it was highly refined. Part of their reasoning for avoiding the oil could be that they are concerned they may have a very severe reaction. It may be that the person has a history of anaphylactic shock from even just a small bit of the protein. It is important to consider these individual differences and respect someone's preferences when serving them. Providing information of the potential for allergens to those with food allergies can help them make decisions to meet their needs. Let's take a closer look at the process that causes an allergic reaction to a protein. As you can see here in this picture, the green structure is what a protein looks like after it has been broken down in your body. All of the purple things around it are antibodies that are attacking that protein. The peg-like things on the outside of the green structure are all of the signals that are telling the body it needs to react and create an immune response. The body really does get tricked in certain situations. Depending on the individual's reaction level, it could be that the initial response of the body is to release a small amount of antibody at first, and then, if the protein is still around, release more. You may see a very early reaction for someone with, for example, a soy allergy that eats a product with soy and just gets an initial burning sensation. This early symptom happens very quickly after eating the soy, but more serious symptoms might happen later. It may be that they don't happen for an hour or several hours. In some cases, it may even happen almost immediately after the initial reaction. The problem with allergens is that we don't know and we can't predict the type of reaction and when it will occur. In fact, those who have allergies may have different reactions based on how much of the protein they consume, and could also be affected by other factors around their bodies. Recall that somewhere between 4 and 8% of children have food allergies, but only 2% of adults have them. Fewer adults have food allergies because our bodies change over time. Adults have different hormones and growth mechanisms that change how their immune systems work. We can't predict if someone who doesn't have an anaphylactic reaction the second or third time they eat peanuts, for example, will have one the 5th or 6th time they do. We have a very hard time predicting what will happen in the next exposure to the allergen. We have already touched on what an allergic reaction looks like and mentioned a few of the symptoms. A more inclusive list is shown here. An individual could have hives or just flushed skin or a rash. They could feel tingling or an itchy sensation in the mouth, face, or tongue, or notice lip swelling. Some allergic reactions lead to vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps, things that look like foodborne illness. Coughing or wheezing is caused by the airways constricting and more mucus being generated as an immune response. An allergic reaction can also lead to dizziness or lightheadedness. We may see the swelling of the throat or vocal cords, difficulty breathing, a drop of blood pressure, and in the extreme cases, a loss of consciousness. All of these symptoms are due to the body trying to get the allergen out of the body. We know from experience, literature, and cases of food allergies how children are likely to report their responses. They may put their hands to their mouth or pull or scratch their tongues. Their voices may also change. They comment that the food is spicy. Children having allergic reactions to foods aren't always sure what has caused the change within their mouth, but understand that something has changed. They say that their mouth is hot, that something is poking at it, or that it's tingly, itchy, or feels funny. They may also say, "My tongue feels full," or "My throat feels thick." They can't seem to clear their throat, like there's something in there that they can't get out. For people working in the school setting, these are important symptoms and descriptions to recognize. You or someone in the cafeteria setting might be the first person that a child talks to about symptoms they are having in reaction to eating a food. They may never have been exposed to the potential allergen in their food before. Having one in their meal at that particular time might be the first time they have consumed it. Even if there is not a history of an allergic reaction that you know about or that is on file, you still need to be on the lookout for these types of messages coming from a student. This should be a trigger to investigate a little further about what food they are eating and to see if there is a list of ingredients in the menu that could contain any potential allergens. What are the likely foods that lead to allergies? We previously mentioned that there are 8 major food allergens, but there are actually somewhere between 150 and 200 foods that could cause an allergic reaction. We focus on the top 8 because 90% of food allergies in the US come from this list: eggs, milk, soy, wheat, peanuts, tree nuts, such as almonds, walnuts, and pecans, fin fish, and shellfish. A federal law called the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act requires labeling of foods that may contain allergens. The labeling law has been in effect for about a decade now and says packaged foods must be labeled with information about any allergens or potential allergens they contain such that the consumer can clearly see the information on the package. Processed products that come into the cafeteria, many of which are then reheated or cooked, are required to be labeled so you can track information about potential allergens. The label will say things like, "Contains milk, wheat, gluten, or soy," or something similar. Keep in mind, though, that these are the top 8 for the US. In Canada, there is an increased prevalence of sesame seeds as an allergen source, so there are actually 9 top allergens that are required to be labeled, including sesame seeds. Although the US and Canada have very similar cultures and heritage, there are more sesame seed allergies in Canada than there are in the US. Over time, and as a result of migration and an influx of people from different cultural backgrounds, we may see this US list expand slightly to include other things that we don't currently have today. Recall that a food allergy is not an intolerance. We just discussed what foods and ingredients cause food allergies, but what things cause intolerances? Histamine intolerance is one example. Histamines are naturally found in some foods, including cheese, wine, and some fish. Although wine is not likely much of a concern for school cafeterias, we do see it cause symptoms of intolerance in some people. Some individuals can't consume certain types of cheese or fish that contain histamines. Symptoms of an intolerance to histamine can look like an allergic reaction, but the immune system responds to them differently. You have probably heard of lactose intolerance, which we mentioned before. Lactose intolerance occurs when the body is unable to digest the sugar lactose found in dairy foods. Certain additives can also cause food intolerances. MSG is probably the most famous of these. Gluten intolerance, which we will discuss in more detail later in this module, is another example that has become a much hotter topic of conversation during the last 3 or 4 years. People can even have intolerances to corn, yeast, dried fruit, nuts and seeds, vinegar, and pickled and fermented foods, including soy sauce and tofu. A key difference between a food allergy and an intolerance is that for a true allergy, the food has to be avoided to really manage it and avoid any sort of response. For intolerances, a small or trace amount often will not cause any sort of reaction. In general, the more of the intolerant food or food components that are eaten, the more severe the reaction will be. This is not the case for most food allergens, because just a small trace of an allergen can cause a very serious amount of discomfort or more severe symptoms. What about gluten intolerance? Can it look like an allergy? Not really. An allergy to gluten is diagnosed as celiac disease. People with celiac disease are allergic to gliadin, part of the gluten protein that is found in wheat, rye, barley, and sometimes oats, which usually become cross-contaminated during processing. Someone could also have a sensitivity or intolerance to gluten. The body has a wide range of responses to gluten, from damage to the intestines and malabsorption of important nutrients in people with celiac disease, to gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea, upset stomach, bloating, and abdominal pain. In 2014, the Food and Drug Administration defined gluten-free for all of those individuals and now has a standard for packaged products. However, the FDA does not regulate the labeling of gluten-free products in schools, so there is not currently a standard for labeling these foods in schools. Although it helps for those with intolerances and sensitivities to know when those ingredients and components are present in their food, it is more critical for those with food allergies like celiac disease. So far, we have discussed what causes food allergies, how they happen, what foods are important sources of food allergens, and how often we see them in the U.S. Next, let's transition to allergens in the kitchen and how we manage them, because inevitably you will all have students who come through your cafeteria with food allergies. You will have many foods that might contain an allergen. Remember the big 8? It is very likely that at least one of these items is in every cafeteria and every lunch system every day. It is important to talk about how to manage them within your system, because you will have many of these allergens in your kitchens, although maybe less so with shellfish. We will have to be much more concerned about knowing exact ingredients and really taking care to read the labels of the incoming products and ingredients. There are hidden sources of allergens in things like soups, sauces, salad dressings, mixes, cookies, crackers, and baked goods. These are products that often have a lot of ingredients. We may see ingredients like whey protein, which could cause someone who has a dairy allergy to have a reaction in something like a soup, a food that many of us don't associate with dairy. Even though whey protein doesn't sound like a dairy ingredient, it is sometimes used as a thickener. As you can see, it's crucial that you have someone on your staff that is a food allergy expert. This person should be very clear on those top 8 allergens and which of your foods could contain any of those allergens. If someone comes to you and says they have a dairy allergy and need to figure out which foods don't have dairy, having that expert is extremely helpful for knowing exactly which items on the menu would be dairy-free. The other piece that is important for us to manage is cross-contamination or cross-contact. We can apply cross-contamination reduction methods for preventing foodborne illness to allergens. An allergen on a food contact surface or on someone's hands could be problematic if it directly contaminates another ready-to-eat food that does not have that allergen in it. We will refer to cross-contamination as cross-contact because that is how it is recognized by the FDA and USDA and described in the Food Code. However, it means the same thing as cross-contamination, except for a couple of very specific situations. Cross-contamination of ready-to-eat foods is the main issue in terms of foodborne illness, but cooked foods are also a concern when it comes to allergens. We don't cook food hot enough to denature or destroy the allergen protein to to prevent it from being recognized by the body as an allergen. For instance, frying a food that has been in contact with an allergen, such as a dairy or milk product, will heat it to 300 or 400 degrees Fahrenheit, but temperatures above 1500 degrees Fahrenheit are needed to destroy the protein. With cross-contamination in foodborne illness, we worry about bacteria or viruses moving to ready-to-eat foods, where in cross-contact, we are worried about an allergen moving to any food, even if it is going to be cooked afterwards. We will go over a few examples of this later in the module. It is also important for us to think about indirect contamination from particles in the air. For instance, you may have someone who is making a pizza, and they are throwing the dough up in the air, just like you would see in a traditional pizzeria. They are using flour to make sure that dough doesn't stick to the food contact surface. They control that food contact surface extremely well when it comes to cross contact and are not going to put another food on it that needs to be kept separate for someone who has a wheat allergy. But by throwing the dough up in the air with the flour particles, they are now potentially distributing those particles in the air. The very tiny flour particles may end up on foods that are not supposed to have any wheat on them. This could lead to someone having an allergic reaction. Just like in cross-contamination, we are concerned about direct and indirect contamination. We need to consider how to control particles that move through the air, because small particles like flour can become airborne and do have the chance to introduce an allergen to food that otherwise would not have had that allergen. We gave an example of hidden ingredients earlier with whey protein, but what other types of hidden ingredients should you be aware of? For someone who has a dairy allergy, the dairy-containing food is not necessarily going to have the word dairy specifically on the ingredients label. It may say things like whey, casein, and sometimes milk or cheese. Any form of these could lead to a reaction to dairy. The same is true with eggs. The food clearly contains eggs if it says something like, "This contains eggs," but it could instead contain albumin and globulin, two egg proteins that could cause an allergic reaction. Albumin and globulin are often used in processed foods as a binder or emulsifier to hold food together. Foods that contain gluten, bran, or any sort of wheat-based flour, like durum, could cause a reaction from wheat. Lecithin is probably the most common hidden ingredient in soy-containing products. You'll likely see soy lecithin in every processed food from chocolates to chewing gum. It is important that you are actively looking in the foods you are serving for ingredients that indicate allergens. There are many hidden ingredients, and we don't always know exactly what to expect on the label, but the list shown here includes some of the more common ones. When managing the kitchen, we have to worry about equipment and surfaces. This includes everything from mixers, pans, and utensils to tabletops and prep areas that come in contact with foods that you are trying to keep free of allergens. These need to be cleaned and sanitized between uses, especially when there is going to be some sort of allergen present. This is not an easy thing to do, and why you see labels on certain types of processed foods that say things like, "This product was produced in a facility where peanuts are used," or "This product may contain traces of dairy." We don't know how the proteins move, but they can move quite a bit, so it's very important to clean and sanitize between uses. Cleaning and sanitation are a key part of your school's standard operating procedure, and not doing those steps well increases the chance of cross-contact. Having equipment covered or upside down in an area where that food contact surface is protected is a best practice and helps reduce the risk of cross-contact, especially by proteins that move through the air. These tips are generic, so each individual school and cafeteria should have a discussion with the child nutrition director and administration about the number of students with certain allergies and the best practices for keeping the allergens out of their specific foods. Whatever plan is decided will be dictated by the level of potential reactions to food allergens, but regardless of this level, it is important to have a plan for handling allergens in your cafeteria. We discussed flour used to make pizza dough as an example of food particles that could be transferred through the air and potentially lead to cross-contact. In addition to dust from things like flour or meal, the spray coating used to prevent food from sticking to pans can also be carried through the air. Dust from flour or cooking spray are not things we often think about as allergens, but they could be increasing the problem. If you are making a sauce or gravy and are using flour to thicken it, the individual who is going to eat that sauce may not think it contains any specific protein that they would be worried about. Someone with a wheat allergy may not think that there is wheat in the sauce, but there is if wheat-based flour is being used to thicken it. Remembering that these particles can settle on equipment surfaces and then can be moved around the kitchen is something that we need to be concerned about when managing a kitchen. The goal is to control the movement of these protein-containing allergen particles in your kitchen. Other ways to cross-contact include direct contact. We previously discussed the likelihood of cross-contact with cooking oil, so you should recall that commercial cooking oils, like peanut oil used in food service, are typically highly refined and are very unlikely to have any protein left in them. However, if the same cooking oil is used first to fry shrimp and then to cook French fries, the protein from the shrimp could be cross-contacting the French fries if the oil was not changed first. People who have very strong shellfish allergies often avoid places that fry any shellfish in their oil because of that idea that the protein may still be present. Even though that oil gets very hot in the frying stage, it's not likely hot enough to destroy the protein that is left over from the shrimp. Garnishes and toppings are another way to have cross-contact. These should always be included in the written recipe to identify any possible allergens. Finally, hands and gloves are a very good vehicle to transfer allergens from one food to another. Hands must be washed and gloves changed before handling allergen-free foods. You can play a critical role in helping reduce cross-contact and the risk that someone in your cafeteria will have an allergic reaction to a food. In the cafeteria and on the serving line, focus on labeling, separating, and communication. Labeling and separating are especially important in a self-serve type of environment, like a salad bar. Be very clear about what types of allergens might be in certain foods. Use clear, easy-to-read labels, make sure they are in the right foods, and make sure foods are kept separate and that utensils are not shared between foods. Perhaps the biggest step is having a very open line of communication with everyone involved. By clearly communicating the types of things that might be in the food served in the cafeteria, you are creating an open line of communication and are better able to provide students and others you are serving with a safe, allergen-managed food supply. Have an open dialogue between food service staff, the administration, child nutrition directors, and the students about what needs to happen to ensure that someone with a food allergy won't have a reaction. This includes determining a list of foods and ingredients that you know are allergen-free and deciding what you can do to reduce the likelihood of cross-contact and introducing an allergen into those safe foods. The most important point you should take away from this module is to have very strong, open line of communication among those involved, from food preparation to consumption. Each school and each district should have some sort of school protocol on how to handle food allergies, at least in terms of handling someone who is having an allergic reaction and allergens within the cafeteria setting. You should know your school's protocol and your allergy expert, and how the protocol applies to your job and what you are doing. Your role should also include communication with the school nurse, administration, and child nutrition directors. Knowing the protocol is important so that when something happens, the school can effectively manage it. For instance, a big bag of flour spills in the kitchen. You don't know where all those particles went and are worried because your school has a student with a wheat allergy. Having good protocols in place is critical for telling you how to handle this situation. Let's talk about some more examples using real situations. There are around 30,000 allergic reactions per year, 2,000 hospitalizations, and 150 deaths, but these are just numbers. Ultimately, we are talking about real people. It is the kids and students that we're trying to protect and keep safe that have some of the more dire consequences. Natalie was 13 when she died from eating a Rice Krispie treat that had traces of peanut butter in the marshmallow. It happened at a camp where she was there with her family. She went to grab this Rice Krispie treat off a self-serve counter, and it was a wrapped Rice Krispie treat. The camp's protocol, for whatever reason, included peanut butter in the recipe for the Rice Krispie treat. They did not label it. It took a couple of bites for Natalie to realize that there was a taste of peanuts in the Rice Krispie treat. At that time, she went to inform the camp director, who had an EpiPen. The EpiPen was not effective and didn't fire correctly. They are not 100% effective all the time. Natalie passed away from anaphylactic shock before she could get to the hospital. There are two things that happened in this case that led to the problem. The first was that clearly the EpiPen didn't work. But if the Rice Krispie treat had been labeled with all of these ingredients, highlighting that it contained traces of peanuts and was a potential allergen source, Natalie would not have eaten the Rice Krispie treat. This is why knowing all of these foods, the top 8, and knowing which foods have or could contain them is critical. Here is another example of a tragic situation that happened a few years ago. A teenager, Sabrina Shannon, died of cardiac arrest due to anaphylactic shock after eating plain French fries. Sabrina had 2 food allergies that she was worried about. One was peanuts and the other was dairy, and so she let the cafeteria staff know that those were her allergens. She had made the choice to avoid all peanut oil, so she asked specifically if the French fries were fried in peanut oil. The cafeteria staff said that they were not, that they just used vegetable oil. She said that was great and that she could eat them because she didn't even want to worry about whether it was refined because of her history of responses to peanuts. But the tongs that were used to serve her French fries had also been used to serve cheese fries, and they had traces of dairy on them. So this became a cross-contact situation, and just a very small amount of cheese sauce that ended up on those fries led to her reaction and subsequent death. Again, she wasn't able to get to the hospital in time. As we have said, these are real situations. We have mentioned this a few times already, but want to stress that someone in your cafeteria needs to be a food allergen expert, whether it is the manager or another staff member. It is essential for someone on your staff to know your recipes, ingredients, and the potential allergens, the students who have food allergies, and how to respond in a food allergy event when someone is having an allergic reaction. These 3 things are critical for having the ability to manage food allergies. Some of the information that we discussed in this module comes from this document, the Food Allergy Training Guide for Hospital and Food Service Staff, from the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. The link to this resource is shown here. If there are many students in your school with food allergies, this Food Allergy Training Guide is a very good resource for you to use. Feel free to contact Dr. Ben Chapman by email or phone if you have any questions. Thank you for viewing the module, Controlling Allergens, Preparing and Serving Food Safely in School Kitchens. We hope you will join us again for another module on school food safety.